Hi, I'm Garrett. This is Paste. Last week was probably the most newsworthy week in wrestling in literally a couple of decades now since WCW folded. It's sort of absurd how much huge news happened last week. Obviously, you had the debut of All Elite Wrestling on TNT on Wednesday with their weekly TV show, Dynamite. WWE moved SmackDown over to Fox on a primetime broadcast network. Probably the best time slot pro wrestling has had in America, literally since the 50s. Also, you had NWA Power debut with their TV tapings here in Atlanta. ROH crowned a new champion, and then that same champion got fired from his home promotion in Mexico, which has kind of fallen apart due to a family squabble. So there's a lot to cover. Let's jump back into it real fast with AEW. So Dynamite aired on Wednesday night on TNT at 8 p.m. It's going to be a weekly show. The first episode did really well in the ratings, got about 1.45 million viewers, did really well in the demo. It handedly beat NXT, the WWE show that they launched to run opposite AEW. So it was a very successful launch by anyone's metric. And from a storytelling perspective, they did a really good job of focusing on the two main feuds going into their first pay-per-view, Full Gear. Those feuds are Jon Moxley, the former Dean Ambrose from WWE, versus Kenny Omega, who laid Omega out through a glass table after interfering in Omega's main event matchup. And then Cody Rhodes versus Chris Jericho for the AEW World title. That ended with the debut of a new stable, basically. Chris Jericho is going to have a stable of heels backing him up, including the surprise return of Jake Hager, aka the former Jack Swagger from WWE. Also in that stable, you have Santana and Ortiz, the former LAX from Impact. I'm not sure what their name is going to be yet in AEW. And then also Sammy Guevara. So it's a first time Jericho's ever had like a heel stable of his own. And it's a good makeup of, the tag team specialists, like the young, snotty punk heel upstart, and then like the huge muscle guy in the terms of Swagger with Jericho as the champ at the center. So Jericho and Cody will be wrestling in the main event of Full Gear. At the end of that episode of Dynamite, Jericho's crew had laid out not just Cody, but also the Young Bucks and Dustin Rhodes. So you can kind of see the sort of a faction war there between Jericho's guys and the Elite plus Cody's brother Dustin. They can't use the name War Games, obviously, because WWE did acquire that branding despite Dusty Rhodes being the one who came up with that match and that name. But it feels like they're probably building up to some kind of a big tag match like that with the two 5-man teams going against each other. Elsewhere on that episode of Dynamite, they crowned their first women's champion, Riho from Japan, beat Nyla Rose in a long match that wound up becoming really good by the end. The crowd really got into it. It was a really good episode of Dynamite overall. I think if you're looking for an alternative to WWE, something that feels like wrestling used to feel in the past from a storytelling perspective, but with the dynamic, high-flying action of today, I think people would have been happy with that first episode of Dynamite. It'll be interesting to see if they're able to maintain that momentum going forward, both in terms of show quality and also the ratings. WWE countered with an episode of NXT on Wednesday that had limited commercial interruption that was basically promoted like an episode of TakeOver, one of the periodic NXT pay-per-view style events, with the main event of champion Adam Cole going against Matt Riddle. And although that was probably the best match of the night on Wednesday and probably the best TV match of all last week, NXT simply wasn't as entertaining of a show as Dynamite. It had better wrestling, but it didn't feel nearly as important, and it just sort of felt like more NXT, whereas Dynamite did feel like something new and like a real alternative. And in the ratings, not that we're going to care too much about ratings here, but when it goes head-to-head with another show like that, it is interesting to see how NXT, which is a WWE show, although granted their third-tier brand, their promotional brand, couldn't match AEW's premiere. The ratings were much lower, almost half of what they got. I believe it was half in the demo, which is all that matters for advertisers. So if you want to view Wednesday night as some kind of a war, you got to give the first week to AEW. Elsewhere last week, WWE had a very mixed week. They had Raw on Monday as always, and it was a fairly typical episode of Raw that mostly served to build up not just the Hell in the Cell pay-per-view that happened this past Sunday, but also the Crown Jewel event that's going to be occurring in Saudi Arabia at the end of October. Elsewhere, WWE, the big news for the week for them, really two big news items for WWE. As I said earlier, SmackDown premiered on Fox on Friday night. It started with a segment with The Rock making his return, sort of a late advertised return. It wasn't known if he would be there or not until Thursday or Friday. And in his segment, he sort of gave the rub to Becky Lynch, aka The Man, who they've been pushing hard as their top star the last several months, in a segment where they both pretty much verbally and physically beat up King Corbin, who is sort of a punching bag for the fans and everyone else at this point. SmackDown was a very hit and miss show, as you typically see with WWE. Had some good in-ring action, but you had some storytelling decisions that really did not make a lot of sense, especially if they're trying to win over a brand new audience who would be interested maybe less in wrestling and more in a real sports presentation. It did end with a huge angle with Brock Lesnar beating Kofi Kingston for the world title after a single move. It was like a 5-second match. People are very upset about that. Kofi had this 6-month reign where he was booked like a complete killer. And now here he is losing to Brock Lesnar immediately after a single move and then disappearing while they introduced Cain Velasquez from UFC as Brock's next challenger. Cain Velasquez, of course, was the MMA fighter who beat Brock Lesnar in UFC almost 10 years ago now, sort of embarrassing Brock Lesnar in the process. And now they're going to be bringing him into WWE to recreate that feud on a different scale with a pro wrestling presentation. It got them a lot of mainstream sports attention. SmackDown did pretty well in the ratings. It was the highest rated WWE TV show in a while. It'll be, again, interesting to see how that audience holds up as it goes forward week to week. And Sunday, WWE's week concluded with a pay-per-view that has already gone down in infamy. I'm recording this on Monday afternoon, the day after Hell in a Cell, and it's already being considered perhaps the worst WWE pay-per-view of all time, and the latest sign of how out of touch they are with their fans. If you didn't watch the show, the main event match, the one that they pushed the hardest between Seth Rollins, the Universal Champion, and The Fiend, the new Bray Wyatt character, who's sort of like a supernatural evil clown guy or something. I don't know. It was a Hell in a Cell match, which cage matches typically don't have disqualifications, and yet this match ended in what seemed like a disqualification at the time. They've gone back and retroactively said it was a match stoppage decision, which typically doesn't really happen in pro wrestling, but in the process, they not only disappointed the fans in the building and at home by having Seth Rollins basically win the match, but they also killed off his finishers by having him curb stomp The Fiend, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 times it seemed. And every time Bray Wyatt kept getting back up. That used to be sort of the ultimate killing finisher in WWE right now, one that was so bad that they actually banned it for a few years. And now here we go. A guy takes several of them and it doesn't hurt him at all. That's not really a good way to protect who is supposed to be your top star. Of course, the booking of Seth Rollins has been so bad over the last several months, it's hard to call him their top star at this point. The crowd was handedly behind Bray Wyatt last night and was very disappointed when he did not win. If you watched the show, you probably noticed that it ended with the audience loudly chanting for refunds, chanting for AEW, chanting words that I probably shouldn't repeat here, but that let everyone know without a shadow of a doubt how disappointed the audience was. It was basically a catastrophe for WWE, and it's going to be fascinating to see how they rebound from that, what sort of course correction they make on Raw tonight, or if they even acknowledge that it was a problem. They have a history of sort of just blaming that one crowd and still booking whatever they want to book for their own amusement, despite what the fans have obviously shown them they want. The difference now, though, is fans actually have a real alternative in the form of AEW, which didn't really exist until the last few months. So, yeah, the wrestling war, if again you want to call it that, is definitely getting interesting. There are also some other players, minor players, sort of on the periphery of that world. Like I said, NWA Power, this is the reboot of the National Wrestling Alliance that Billy Corgan of Smashing Pumpkins is in charge of. They had their first TV tapings here in Atlanta last week. They're going to debut their weekly YouTube show Tuesdays at 6:05 p.m. on their YouTube channel. Their top stars right now are Nick Aldis, the current NWA World Champion, and James Storm, Eli Drake, Colt Cabana. It's a weird crew of sort of misfit toys in a sense, guys who couldn't really latch on anywhere else. People who came from Impact. Colt Cabana, obviously a top indie guy, and he still works for Ring of Honor as well. And Rock and Roll Express were a big part of the tapings. I wasn't able to make it. Obviously, I haven't seen them yet. I'll be watching on YouTube this week and next week. But as a kid from Georgia who grew up watching the old studio show on TBS as a kid, I'm really intrigued to see what Billy Corgan had and has in store for us. And then finally, Ring of Honor. Really, the week started the Friday before last with Ring of Honor's latest pay-per-view. It ended with Rush, the star from Mexico, winning their world title, defeating Matt Taven for the belt. And that should have been the big news of the night. But then later in the night, some shocking news broke out of CMLL, the world's oldest wrestling promotion, which is Rush's home promotion. He and his brother, Dragon Lee, who's one of the top young stars in CMLL, they were both fired from CMLL as punishment for basically missing a CMLL show for Dragon Lee to wrestle in PWG's Bola. Also, it's part of a fallout between what has become a pretty ugly war between the family that owns CMLL. CMLL's main owner, Paco Alonso, died back in June, and his daughter, Sophia, was expecting to take over the company. But instead, Paco Alonso's uncle, Chavo Luderoth, who actually stepped down in the 80s to let Paco take over, he has taken the company back over and minimized Sophia's role within it. And that has led to a lot of dissension among its talent. CMML is, as I said, it's the oldest wrestling promotion in the world. It's been promoting consistently since the 30s. They're partners of New Japan, partners with Ring of Honor. They own Arena Mexico. They're a huge tourist destination in Mexico City. And right now, they seem to be falling apart. It'll be really fascinating to see what happens here, to see if they're somehow able to bridge the peace between Sophia Alonso and Chavo Luderoth, or if she breaks away and starts her own promotion, which has been heavily rumored. Rush and Dragon Lee, who were two of their top stars, are already being booked in Mexico for other promotions. They are going to be facing the Lucha Brothers, Pentagon Jr. and Phoenix at a Crash show. So it's turmoil down in Mexico, just at the same time as we see the American scene becoming heated in a way it hasn't been in decades. If you're a wrestling fan, this is probably the most exciting the business has been in a long time. It's since 2001, when WCW went out of business, this is the first time we've really seen this level of competition in the American wrestling industry, especially. So keep watching Paste if you want to keep tabs on all of that, if you want to see what my opinions are as well. Thanks again. I'm Garrett. This has been Paste, talking about wrestling, the professional kind, which I'm a fan of. Thanks.